The parking lot was nearly empty at 11:47 p.m. Just scattered pools of yellow light from security lamps casting long shadows between the white lines. She sat in her decade-old Honda Civic, engine off, windows cracked just enough to let in the October air that carried the scent of approaching rain. 3 hours she'd been waiting, watching the entrance to the Federal Emergency Management Building, checking her phone every few minutes for a message that never came. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Then the distant rumble began rolling across the sky, growing louder until it became unmistakable, the heavy thump of military rotors cutting through the night. The Black Hawk appeared over the tree line like something from another world, its navigation lights piercing the darkness as it descended toward the empty lot where she sat alone. Lieutenant Commander Rebecca Walsh hadn't expected to spend her evening in a parking lot outside Quantico, Virginia, but the last 18 hours had shattered every expectation she'd held about her military career. 24 hours earlier, she'd been coordinating disaster relief operations from her comfortable office at the Defense Logistics Agency, managing supply chains and evacuation protocols with the methodical precision that had earned her recognition. Throughout the Department of Defense, her specialty was crisis logistics, the complex choreography of moving people, equipment, and supplies during natural disasters when normal infrastructure collapsed. Hurricane Katrina had been her baptism by fire as a young officer, teaching her that the difference between life and death often came down to having the right resources in the right place at precisely the right moment. Since then, she'd coordinated responses to tornadoes in Oklahoma, wildfires in California, and floods across the Midwest. But Hurricane Elena was different. The storm had intensified beyond all meteorological predictions, transforming from a Category 2 nuisance into a Category 5 monster in less than 12 hours. It was bearing down on the Gulf Coast with winds exceeding 180 miles per hour, storm surge projections reaching unprecedented heights, and a track that would devastate communities still rebuilding from previous disasters. The evacuation should have been straightforward. Rebecca had spent weeks developing contingency plans for exactly this scenario, coordinating with state emergency management agencies, identifying shelter locations, and establishing supply distribution points. Every detail had been mapped, every resource allocated, every communication protocol established. The plan called for systematic evacuation of coastal areas, beginning with the most vulnerable populations, nursing homes, hospitals, and low-lying communities without reliable transportation. Federal assets would support state and local efforts, providing transportation, temporary shelters, and emergency supplies. It was a textbook disaster response, the kind of operation that Rebecca could execute in her sleep. But politics had intervened. With the brutal efficiency of a bureaucratic hurricane, the governor of Louisiana, facing a tight re-election race, had initially downplayed the storm's severity, concerned that premature evacuations would damage the state's tourism economy and make him appear alarmist. By the time meteorologists confirmed Elena's explosive intensification, the window for orderly evacuation was rapidly closing. Federal officials in Washington began distancing themselves from the unfolding disaster, unwilling to override state authorities or commit resources without explicit political cover. Rebecca watched from her operations center as conference calls devolved into finger-pointing sessions, with officials more concerned about avoiding blame than saving lives. The breaking point came during a video conference with the Secretary of Homeland Security. Rebecca had presented her analysis showing that delaying federal intervention for another 24 hours would result in thousands of people trapped in the storm's path with no means of escape. The data was unambiguous: immediate action could save lives, but only if they moved within the next 6 hours. The Secretary's response had been coldly political. Commander Walsh, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but we cannot commit federal resources without proper authorization from state officials. The optics of federal overreach during an election year are simply unacceptable. Rebecca had stared at the screen in disbelief. Sir, we're talking about human lives. The storm will make landfall in 36 hours. If we don't begin emergency transportation now, people will die. That's not our decision to make, Commander. We follow proper channels. She'd ended the call knowing that proper channels would result in improper graves. For the next 4 hours, she'd worked frantically through unofficial networks, reaching out to contacts in the Coast Guard, National Guard, and volunteer organizations. The response was consistent. Everyone wanted to help, but no one could act. Without federal authorization, that wasn't coming. At 6 p.m., she'd made the decision that would define the rest of her career. Instead of going home to her apartment in Arlington, she'd driven to the parking lot outside the FEMA building and began making phone calls that bypassed every protocol in the Federal Emergency Response Handbook. Her first call was to Colonel James Mitchell, an old friend from her deployment in Afghanistan, who now commanded a helicopter squadron at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. She'd explained the situation in terms that cut through bureaucratic double talk. American citizens were about to die because politicians were afraid to act. Rebecca, you know I can't authorize a military operation without proper orders, Mitchell had said, but his tone suggested he was looking for reasons to say yes rather than no. I'm not asking you to authorize anything, James. I'm asking you to be ready when authorization comes. Her second call was to Captain Maria Santos at the Coast Guard Air Station in New Orleans, a woman who'd pulled Rebecca from a sinking helicopter during the rescue operation 3 years earlier. Santos listened without interruption as Rebecca outlined what needed to happen. How many people are we talking about? Santos asked. Minimum 3,000 in the immediate impact zone. Probably closer to 5,000 if we include the barrier islands. Jesus, Rebecca, that's a massive operation. It's a massive storm. The third call was the most dangerous. Rebecca contacted Alexandra Thompson, a senior official at the Federal Aviation Administration, who had the authority to clear airspace for emergency operations. Thompson had worked with Rebecca during previous disasters and trusted her judgment. But what Rebecca was proposing pushed far beyond normal procedures. You're asking me to authorize unrestricted military and civilian air operations in a hurricane environment without official disaster declaration, Thompson said slowly. I'm asking you to save lives while there's still time to save them. By 9 p.m., Rebecca had assembled an unofficial coalition of federal, state, and military officials who were willing to act first and seek forgiveness later. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. If they couldn't get official authorization for a federal response, they would coordinate individual actions that together constituted massive rescue operation. Each participant would operate within their existing authority while coordinating with others through unofficial channels. The Coast Guard would conduct routine training exercises that happened to occur in areas where civilians needed evacuation. Military helicopters would perform equipment testing that involved picking up stranded residents. Federal emergency supplies would be repositioned for inventory purposes to locations where they'd be needed for disaster relief. It was the kind of bureaucratic sleight of hand that could result in court-martial proceedings, congressional investigations, and the end of multiple careers. But it was also the only way to mount a rescue operation large enough to matter. The final piece of the puzzle required Rebecca to physically coordinate the operation from a location where she could maintain communication with all participants while remaining outside official channels. The FEMA parking lot provided perfect access to federal communication networks while maintaining plausible deniability for her superiors. She'd been sitting in her car for 3 hours, laptop balanced on her steering wheel, coordinating the largest unauthorized rescue operation in American history through encrypted text messages and secure phone calls. Coast Guard helicopters were already airborne. National Guard trucks were moving toward evacuation zones, and military transport aircraft were being loaded with emergency supplies. Now, the Black Hawk was descending toward her position. Its rotor wash scattering loose papers and debris across the empty parking lot. The helicopter wasn't supposed to exist according to any official flight manifest, but it was about to take her to the center of a disaster where thousands of people needed someone willing to break rules in order to save lives. The Blackhawk's crew chief extended his hand as Rebecca climbed aboard, shouting over the rotor noise, "Commander Walsh? Colonel Mitchell sends his regards. We're flying dark to avoid air traffic complications." The helicopter lifted off immediately, banking sharply toward the southeast as the lights of Quantico fell away below. Rebecca strapped herself into the crew compartment, surrounded by communication equipment that would serve as her mobile command center for the next critical hours. The aircraft's interior was configured for special operations rather than passenger transport. Banks of encrypted radios, satellite uplinks, and digital displays showing weather data that painted Hurricane Elena as an expanding spiral of destruction. Across the Gulf of Mexico, the pilot's voice crackled through her headset. "Commander, we've got a 90-minute flight to the staging area. The weather's deteriorating rapidly along the coast, so this might be our last window for safe insertion." Through the helicopter's windows, Rebecca watched the landscape transform from the urban sprawl of Northern Virginia to the rural farmland of North Carolina. Small towns appeared as clusters of light connected by the dark ribbons of highways that would soon be clogged with evacuees, if they were lucky enough to receive evacuation orders in time. Her laptop screen displayed a real-time operational picture that most federal officials wouldn't see for another 12 hours. Coast Guard helicopters were already conducting training flights along the Louisiana coast, discreetly marking locations where people were refusing to evacuate or lacked transportation to leave. National Guard units in 3 states were moving toward staging areas under the cover of routine readiness exercises. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The most delicate element of the operation involved civilian resources. Rebecca had reached out to helicopter tour companies, offshore oil support services, and private charter operations throughout the Gulf region. Many of these pilots had lived through previous hurricanes and understood that official help often arrived too late to matter. Captain Sandra Rodriguez, who operated a small charter service out of Houma, Louisiana, had responded to Rebecca's encrypted message within minutes. "How many people do you need to move and where do they need to go?" "Potentially hundreds from the barrier islands and isolated communities. Standard evacuation shelters inland. My aircraft can handle 6 passengers per trip. I've got 3 helicopters available and pilots willing to fly until the weather shuts." U.S. down. Similar conversations had taken place with boat operators, bus companies, and emergency medical services. Each agreed to participate in what Rebecca carefully described as preparedness exercises that would position resources exactly where they'd be needed when official authorization finally came. The coordination required split-second timing across multiple agencies and organizations that had never worked together before. Rebecca's military training in Afghanistan had taught her to manage complex logistics under hostile conditions, but this operation pushed beyond anything she'd previously attempted. Her secure phone buzzed with a text from Colonel Mitchell. "Advance. Team reports weather window closing faster than predicted. You'll have maybe 4 hours on the ground before conditions become unsurvivable. 4 hours to coordinate the evacuation of thousands of people across hundreds of square miles of coastal terrain." The mathematics were brutal, but not impossible if every element of the improvised operation functioned perfectly. The Black Hawk's navigation system showed they were crossing into Mississippi airspace, still 200 miles from the Louisiana coast where Hurricane Elena's outer bands were already bringing tropical storm force winds. Weather radar painted the storm as a massive clockwise spiral covering nearly half the Gulf of Mexico, with an eye wall so tightly organized that meteorologists were comparing it to Hurricane Camille, the benchmark for catastrophic Gulf Coast destruction. Rebecca opened her emergency communication protocols, establishing contact with her network of unofficial coordinators. Each check-in confirmed that pieces of the operation were falling into place, but also revealed the enormous scope of what they were attempting. From the Coast Guard Air Station in New Orleans, we have 12 helicopters positioned for immediate deployment. Pilots briefed on evacuation routes and landing zones. Officially, we're conducting storm preparedness training. From the Louisiana National Guard, 43 vehicles staged at forward positions. Medical teams embedded with each convoy, waiting for your signal to begin movement toward coastal communities. From the Federal Aviation Administration, airspace cleared for emergency operations under existing storm protocols. We can maintain this window for 6 hours maximum before questions get asked at higher levels. The most challenging element involved coordinating with local officials who weren't part of the unofficial network, but whose cooperation was essential for successful evacuations. Many parish emergency managers and small-town mayors had been waiting for state or federal authorization. That wasn't coming. Rebecca's approach was to provide them with just enough information to understand that help was available without revealing the operation's unauthorized nature. Sheriff David Patterson of Plaquemines Parish had been her first local contact. His jurisdiction included some of the most vulnerable communities in Hurricane Elena's projected path fishing villages and oil worker camps on barrier islands, with only one road leading to higher ground. Commander, I've been begging the state for evacuation assistance for 6 hours, Patterson had told her during their initial conversation. My deputies can reach most of the communities, but we don't have transportation for everyone who needs to leave. Sheriff, what if transportation became available through federal training exercises that happen to be occurring in your area? I'd consider that a remarkable coincidence and make sure my people knew how to take advantage of it. Similar conversations with fire chiefs, emergency medical coordinators, and harbor masters had created a network of local officials who understood that questions about authorization were less important than saving lives. The Black Hawk began its descent toward a small regional airport 50 miles inland from New Orleans. The facility served as a staging area for offshore oil operations, with runways capable of handling large transport aircraft and fuel supplies adequate for extended helicopter operations. Through the aircraft's windows, Rebecca could see the organized chaos of her improvised command center taking shape. Military vehicles were arriving in unmarked convoys, civilian helicopters were being refueled and serviced, and communication trailers were being positioned to coordinate the massive operation. About to unfold. As the Black Hawk touched down, Rebecca felt the weight of command settling on her shoulders. Within the next hour, she would begin directing an evacuation operation involving hundreds of aircraft, thousands of personnel, and tens of thousands of civilians, all without a single piece of official authorization. The crew chief opened the helicopter's door, and Rebecca stepped into the humid Louisiana air that already carried the sharp electrical tension of an approaching storm. Hurricane Elena was still 12 hours from landfall, but the wind was beginning to shift, and the barometric pressure was dropping with the steady inevitability of approaching catastrophe. Her improvised command post awaited, surrounded by the men and women who had chosen to risk their careers on the judgment of a logistics officer who believed that saving lives mattered more than following proper channels. The Black Hawk materialized from the darkness like something out of a fever dream, its running lights cutting precise patterns against the star-filled sky. Rebecca had expected a standard medical evacuation helicopter, the kind she had worked with dozens of times before. What descended toward the abandoned gas station was something entirely different. This aircraft bore no identifying markings, no medical crosses, no unit designations that would reveal its origin or mission. As the helicopter settled onto the cracked asphalt 50 meters away, Rebecca could see figures moving inside the cargo compartment. Not medical personnel preparing to receive a patient for transport. Not military officers coming to brief her on the situation ahead. These were people in civilian clothing, their postures suggesting urgency that bordered on panic. The crew chief jumped down before the rotors stopped spinning and ran toward her with movements that communicated crisis rather than routine medical evacuation. Behind him, two people emerged from the aircraft carrying something between them. Not a stretcher, not medical equipment. A small figure wrapped in what looked like a space blanket, moving with the jerky, uncoordinated motions of someone fighting against chemical sedation. Dr. Martinez. The crew chief had to shout over the rotor noise. "We need you airborne in 30 seconds. The patient is a 7-year-old girl. She's been exposed to something we can't identify. Symptoms are progressing rapidly." Rebecca grabbed her medical kit and ran toward the helicopter, her mind already shifting into emergency response mode. Child patients required completely different protocols, different calculations for medication dosages, different approaches to trauma treatment. But as she got closer to the aircraft, details became visible that stopped her cold. The little girl wasn't injured in any conventional sense. Her skin had a grayish pallor that Rebecca had never seen in living patients, and she was mumbling in a language that sounded like no dialect she could identify. Her eyes were open but unfocused, pupils dilated to points that suggested neurological involvement far beyond anything that could be explained by standard toxicology. What kind of exposure? Rebecca climbed into the cargo compartment as the crew chief secured her equipment. The helicopter was already lifting off, rising rapidly into the night sky with a sense of urgency that made casual conversation impossible. The man sitting across from the girl looked like he hadn't slept in days. His civilian clothes were rumpled, his hands shaking slightly as he monitored equipment that Rebecca didn't recognize. "We don't know. She was found at a research facility in Utah. Everyone else at the site is dead." Rebecca began her initial assessment while the helicopter banked sharply eastward, flying at an altitude that suggested they were avoiding commercial air traffic corridors. The girl's vital signs were stable but abnormal in ways that defied her. Medical training. Heart rate too slow for someone her age, blood pressure readings that fluctuated wildly, and a body temperature that registered 3 degrees below what should have been survivable. How long has she been like this? Rebecca attached monitoring leads while trying to ignore the fact that the girl's skin felt wrong under her fingers. Not cold, exactly, but with a texture that seemed to shift between normal human flesh and something else entirely. 18 hours since initial exposure. She was found in a containment unit that had been breached from the inside. The man handed her a tablet displaying data that made no sense according to any medical reference she knew. The other subjects didn't survive the first 6 hours. Other subjects. The phrase hit Rebecca like a physical impact. This wasn't an industrial accident or environmental contamination. This was human experimentation gone wrong, and she was looking at either the sole survivor or the last person to die from whatever had killed everyone else at the Utah facility. The girl's mumbling intensified, and Rebecca realized she was speaking in what sounded like multiple languages simultaneously. Fragments of English mixed with sounds that could have been Russian, Arabic, or dialects she couldn't identify. But no 7-year-old child should have been capable of linguistic knowledge, regardless of educational background. Dr. Martinez. The helicopter's medical officer handed her a sealed envelope, marked with classification stamps she had never seen before. "Your orders. This mission is compartmentalized above your current clearance level. You're authorized to know only what's necessary to keep the subject alive." Rebecca opened the envelope and found instructions that made her question everything she thought she understood about medical ethics. She was to perform experimental treatments using protocols that had never been tested on human subjects. The goal wasn't to cure the girl, but to study how her system was processing the unknown exposure, while keeping her alive long enough for data collection. The moral implications struck her immediately. This child needed medical treatment, not experimentation. Whatever had happened to her at the Utah facility, she deserved care focused on her well-being, not research priorities that treated her as a specimen rather than a patient. "I need to know what she was exposed to," Rebecca said, looking directly at the civilian researcher. "I can't treat symptoms without understanding the cause. That information is classified beyond your clearance level." His response was automatic, delivered with the kind of bureaucratic finality that ended discussions before they could begin. Rebecca looked down at the girl, whose condition seemed to be deteriorating even as they spoke. Her breathing had become more labored, and the strange coloration was spreading up her neck toward her face. Whatever process was happening inside her body was accelerating, and the experimental treatments outlined in the sealed orders might kill her faster than the original exposure. The helicopter banked again, and through the windows Rebecca could see lights that indicated they were approaching a military installation. Not a hospital, not a research facility designed for patient care. This was a place where the girl would disappear into classified programs that prioritize data collection over human life. "Where are we taking her?" Rebecca asked, though she suspected the answer would be another classification deflection. "Edwards Air Force Base. There's a containment facility prepared for subjects with unknown pathogen exposure." The medical officer spoke as if discussing cargo rather than a 7-year-old girl who was dying from something that should never have been inflicted on a child. Rebecca made a decision that would define the rest of her career. The experimental protocols in her orders were medical malpractice disguised as national security. This girl needed treatment, not torture disguised as research. She needed someone to advocate for her well-being instead of treating her as an expendable test subject. "I'm not following these orders," Rebecca said, holding up the sealed instructions. "This child needs medical care, not experimentation." The silence in the helicopter cargo compartment was immediate and absolute. The civilian researcher stopped monitoring his equipment. The medical officer's hand moved toward his sidearm. The crew chief's expression shifted from professional efficiency to something approaching alarm. "Dr. Martinez," the medical officer's voice carried a warning that made the threat explicit. "You signed security agreements that make refusal of orders a federal crime. The consequences for compromising this mission extend beyond your medical career." Rebecca looked down at the girl, whose condition was deteriorating rapidly enough that she might not survive the flight to Edwards. Whatever moral choice she made in the next few minutes would determine whether this child lived as a human being deserving of medical care, or died as a classified experiment that officially never happened. The helicopter continued eastward through the Nevada darkness, carrying them toward a decision point that would test everything Rebecca believed about medical ethics, human dignity, and the limits of what civilized people should accept in the name of national security. Rebecca's hands moved with surgical precision as she began treating the girl, according to her medical judgment rather than the classified protocols. The experimental orders called for collecting tissue samples and monitoring organ function while the unknown pathogen progressed through her system. Rebecca instead started in 4-line and began administering supportive care designed to counter the symptoms she could observe. "Dr. Martinez, you need to step back from the patient." The medical officer's voice carried authority backed by the weight of military discipline and federal law. "These orders come from the highest levels of government. The national security implications of this situation override individual medical decisions." The girl's breathing had become increasingly labored, and her skin temperature continued dropping. toward levels that would soon cause irreversible organ damage. Rebecca ignored the commands and adjusted her treatment approach, using techniques she had developed for hypothermia cases in extreme environments. The child's body was shutting down systematically, but not in ways that matched any known pathogen or toxic exposure. "Look at her vital signs," Rebecca said, pointing to the monitoring equipment. "She's dying. Your protocols are designed to study the process, not prevent it. I took an oath to do no harm, and that's exactly what your orders require." The civilian researcher moved closer, his equipment beeping with increased frequency as the girl's condition deteriorated. "The data we collect from this subject could save thousands of lives. We need to understand how the pathogen affects human physiology before we can develop countermeasures." Rebecca continued her treatment while calculating how much time she had. Before the helicopter reached Edwards Air Force Base, 20 minutes, maybe 30 if the pilot encountered headwinds. Enough time to stabilize the girl's condition if she could work without interference, but not enough to reverse whatever damage had already been done by 18 hours of exposure to something that shouldn't exist. The girl's mumbling had evolved into something that sounded almost like communication, though the words came from languages she couldn't possibly know. Rebecca had treated patients with neurological injuries before, but this was different. The child wasn't delirious or hallucinating. She was speaking with the fluency of someone who had learned multiple languages over years of study. "Dr. Martinez." The crew chief interrupted her work. "We're receiving new orders from command. The containment facility at Edwards has been compromised. We're being diverted to a secondary location." The helicopter banked sharply northward, and through the windows Rebecca could see they were heading toward mountains that rose like black walls against the star field. Secondary location meant a facility even more classified than Edwards, probably a site that existed completely outside official military structure. Places where people disappeared without leaving any trace in bureaucratic records. Rebecca made her decision with the same clarity that had guided her through thousands of surgical procedures. She couldn't save this child by following orders that treated her as expendable. The only way to preserve her life was to remove her from a system that valued data more than human dignity. "I need to speak with the pilot," Rebecca said, standing up in the cramped cargo compartment. The medical officer blocked her path, but she had anticipated resistance. "That girl needs immediate hospitalization at a civilian facility. Her condition is deteriorating beyond what field treatment can address." The pilot follows military orders, not medical recommendations. The medical officer's hand remained positioned near his sidearm, making the threat clear without being explicit. "Sit down and continue treatment according to the protocols you were given." Rebecca had spent 8 years in emergency medicine, including deployments in combat zones where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. She had learned to read situations quickly, assess risks accurately, and act decisively when conventional approaches failed. This situation required tactics that went beyond medical training. The girl's condition was stabilizing slightly under Rebecca's treatment, but she remained critically ill and would need intensive care resources that didn't exist at classified research facilities. More importantly, she needed advocates who would prioritize her welfare over experimental value. People who would fight for her right to be treated as a patient rather than a specimen. Rebecca reached into her medical kit and withdrew a sedative that she normally reserved for patients experiencing extreme trauma. Not for the girl, but for the medical officer whose attention was focused on monitoring her treatment rather than watching her hands. The injection was delivered with the same precision she used for surgical procedures, fast enough to prevent defensive reaction and calculated to cause unconsciousness without permanent harm. The medical officer collapsed before he could draw his weapon, and Rebecca immediately turned her attention to the civilian researcher. "You have 2 choices. Help me get this girl to a civilian hospital, or join your colleague on the floor." The researcher's hands shook as he backed away from the monitoring equipment. You don't understand the implications. That pathogen could spread beyond her system. Civilian hospitals aren't equipped for containment protocols. Then help me contain it properly. Rebecca was already moving toward the helicopter's communication equipment. This child deserves medical care, not experimentation. We can study the pathogen after we save her life. The crew chief had been monitoring their conversation through the aircraft's internal communication system, and Rebecca could see him speaking urgently with the pilot. The helicopter's course remained steady toward the mysterious secondary facility, but she still had a few minutes to change the situation before they reached a point of no return. Rebecca activated the aircraft's emergency medical frequency and began broadcasting a distress call that would reach civilian emergency services rather than military command. This is Dr. Rebecca Martinez aboard a military aircraft with a pediatric patient in critical condition. We are requesting immediate clearance for emergency landing at the nearest civilian trauma center. The response came immediately from multiple sources. Air traffic control, hospital emergency departments, and military communications all tried to establish contact simultaneously. Rebecca ignored the military frequencies and focused on coordinating with Las Vegas trauma centers that could provide the intensive care resources the girl needed. Dr. Martinez, you are compromising a classified operation. The pilot's voice came through the internal communication system with barely controlled anger. I have orders to proceed to the designated facility regardless of patient condition. Change course to University Medical Center, Rebecca responded while continuing her treatment of the girl. This patient will die without immediate access to pediatric intensive care. Your orders don't supersede medical necessity. The helicopter continued toward the mountains, but Rebecca could feel the aircraft's speed decreasing slightly as the pilot processed conflicting demands. Military orders versus emergency medical protocols. Classified mission requirements versus the Hippocratic Oath. The tension between institutional loyalty and human decency. Rebecca looked down at the girl, whose condition had improved enough that her breathing was becoming more regular and her skin temperature was slowly rising toward normal levels. Whatever pathogen she had been exposed to, it responded to conventional supportive treatment when someone prioritized her survival over data collection. The civilian researcher moved closer to Rebecca, his voice dropping to a whisper that wouldn't be picked up by the aircraft's communication system. There are 12 other facilities conducting similar research. This girl isn't the only subject. If you compromise this mission, you'll never have access to help the others. The revelation hit Rebecca like a physical blow. This wasn't an isolated incident or single experiment gone wrong. This was a systematic program involving multiple locations and dozens of children who had been exposed to pathogens that existed outside any legitimate medical research. The girl in her care represented just one victim in a network of human experimentation that operated under the just one victim in a network of human experimentation that operated under the protection of national security classifications. Rebecca realized that saving this one child was only the beginning of a much larger moral crisis that would define the rest of her life. The helicopter's engine suddenly changed pitch, and Rebecca felt the aircraft banking sharply toward the south. Through the windows, she could see the bright lights of Las Vegas spreading across the desert floor like a constellation fallen to Earth. The pilot had made his choice, prioritizing medical emergencies over military orders in a decision that would end his career and possibly his freedom. University Medical Center. This is an Army Black Hawk requesting immediate emergency landing. The pilot's voice came through both the radio and internal communication system. We have a pediatric patient in critical condition requiring immediate intensive care. The response from the hospital's trauma team was immediate and professional. Landing coordinates, medical team deployment, preparation of pediatric intensive care resources. Rebecca could hear the controlled urgency in their voices as they mobilized resources for a patient whose condition they couldn't fully understand until she arrived, but their victory was temporary. Rebecca's radio crackled with transmissions from military frequencies that she had tried to ignore. Black Hawk 77 Delta, you are ordered to divert immediately to Nellis Air Force Base. Do not land at civilian facilities. This is a direct order from Northcom. The pilot's response was brief and final. University Medical Center, we are 3 minutes from landing. The patient's condition is critical and deteriorating. Rebecca looked down at the girl who had begun responding to treatment in ways that defied everything she understood about the pathogen's effects. Her skin color was returning to normal, her breathing had stabilized, and the strange multilingual mumbling had decreased to occasional whispered words in what sounded like her native English. The civilian researcher moved closer, his monitoring equipment still recording data that would disappear into classified databases regardless of where they landed. Dr. Martinez, you need to understand what you've done. This pathogen isn't naturally occurring. It was engineered in a laboratory. And this girl's exposure was intentional. She's not a victim of an accident. She's the product of deliberate human experimentation. The revelation struck Rebecca with the force of physical impact. This child hadn't been in the wrong place at the wrong time. She had been selected, prepared, and deliberately exposed to something designed to alter human physiology in ways that pushed the boundaries of what life could sustain. The Utah facility hadn't suffered an accident. It had achieved exactly the results it was designed to produce. How many others? Rebecca continued her treatment while processing implications that made her question everything she thought she knew about the limits of government-sanctioned research. Dozens across multiple facilities. Different pathogens, different objectives, all designed to test human adaptation to biological agents that don't exist in nature. The researcher's voice carried something that might have been remorse, though. Rebecca suspected it was fear of consequences rather than genuine regret. This program has been operational for 5 years. The helicopter descended rapidly toward the hospital's landing pad, where Rebecca could see trauma teams assembling with the precision that characterized major medical centers. Doctors, nurses, respiratory therapists, and technicians who would treat this girl as a patient requiring care rather than a specimen providing data. But as they approached the landing pad, Rebecca could also see other vehicles arriving at the hospital. Black SUVs with government license plates, unmarked sedans that screened federal law enforcement, and personnel in civilian clothes who moved with military bearing. The system was mobilizing to contain the situation before it could expand beyond controllable limits. Dr. Martinez, the pilot's voice carried a warning and apology in equal measure. There are federal agents surrounding the landing pad. They're not going to let us transfer the patient to civilian care. Rebecca made the most difficult decision of her medical career. She opened the helicopter's side door while they were still 50 feet above the hospital, activated her emergency repelling gear, and prepared to deliver the girl directly to the trauma team waiting below. The technique was dangerous under ideal conditions, potentially fatal with a critically ill patient, but it was the only way to get her into the hands of doctors who would prioritize her well-being. Dr. Martinez, don't do this, the researcher grabbed her arm as she prepared to descend. That girl is carrying pathogens that could kill everyone in the hospital. You're risking a pandemic to save one life. Rebecca looked him directly in the eyes and saw the truth behind his fear. This wasn't about containing dangerous pathogens. This was about maintaining control over research programs that violated every principle of medical ethics and human rights. The girl wasn't dangerous to others. She was dangerous to the people who had used her as an experimental subject. The descent to the hospital landing pad took 43 seconds, with the girl secured against Rebecca's chest in a harness designed for medical evacuations under combat conditions. The trauma team was waiting with equipment and expertise that made her own field treatment look primitive by comparison. 7-year-old female, exposure to unknown biological agent, 18 hours post-exposure, responding to supportive care. Rebecca rattled off the girl's medical history as the hospital team took control of her care. She needs intensive monitoring and isolation protocols, but I believe her condition is stabilizing. The federal agents moved in immediately, surrounding Rebecca with the kind of professional efficiency that left no room for resistance or negotiation. Dr. Martinez, you are under arrest for violation of the Espionage Act, compromising classified operations and endangering national security. But their timing was 43 seconds too late. The girl was already in the hands of civilian medical personnel who would document her condition, photograph her injuries, and create medical records that would exist independently of any classification. System. The hospital's legal department would demand court orders before releasing a pediatric patient to federal custody, buying time for media attention and public scrutiny. As Rebecca was escorted away from the landing pad in restraints, she could see the girl being wheeled into the hospital's emergency department, surrounded by doctors and nurses who would fight for her right to proper medical care, protected by institutional policies that prioritized patient welfare over government convenience. The helicopter that had brought them to Las Vegas was already lifting off, carrying the researcher and his equipment back toward facilities that officially didn't exist. But the data he had collected would be incomplete now, compromised by Rebecca's treatment decisions and the girl's transfer to civilian care. Rebecca had saved one life and exposed a program that had destroyed dozens of others. She had chosen medical ethics over institutional loyalty, human dignity over national security priorities. The consequences would define the rest of her life, but sitting in the back of a federal vehicle, watching Las Vegas disappear behind them, she knew she had made the only choice that allowed her to remain a doctor rather than becoming an accomplice to atrocities disguised as research. The girl would survive, recover, and hopefully find people who would help her heal from traumas that extended far beyond her physical injuries. That knowledge would have to sustain Rebecca through whatever legal and professional consequences awaited her in facilities that were as classified as the research program she had chosen to betray. Real mission had chosen her after all. Not the one described in encrypted orders, but the one that required choosing humanity over authority when the two became irreconcilable. 18 months after that night in the Nevada desert, Rebecca Martinez walked through the halls of Seattle Children's Hospital as the head of their new pediatric trauma ethics department. The legal battles had taken 8 months to resolve, but public pressure generated by media coverage of classified human experimentation had forced the government to offer immunity in exchange for her testimony before congressional committees. Little girl she had saved was now 9 years old, living with a foster family in Oregon under a new identity that protected her from any remaining elements of the research program. Medical tests showed no lasting effects from her exposure to the engineered pathogen, but psychological counseling would continue for years as she processed memories of experiences that no child should have survived. Rebecca's congressional testimony had been delivered in closed sessions, but enough details emerged to trigger investigations that revealed the scope of illegal human experimentation conducted under national security classifications. 12 facilities across 7 states had been conducting research that violated every international treaty on human rights, medical ethics, and the protection of children from exploitation. The program had been terminated officially, though Rebecca suspected similar research continued in locations that had learned better operational security from the exposure of the Utah facility. 47 children had been identified as subjects in various experiments, with 31 survivors located and provided with medical care and psychological support through specially established programs. Dr. Sarah Chun knocked on Rebecca's office door, carrying files that contained case studies from the aftermath of the congressional investigations. As Rebecca's research partner, she had helped establish protocols for treating survivors of unethical medical experiments, developing therapeutic approaches that addressed both physical trauma and psychological damage. The Morrison case files are ready for your review, Dr. Chen said, placing the documents on Rebecca's desk. Morrison was the code name for the overall investigation into classified human experimentation, chosen to avoid direct reference to government agencies that remained unnamed in public reports. Rebecca opened the first file and saw photographs of children who had survived experiments designed to test human tolerance for biological agents, psychological manipulation techniques, and medical procedures that pushed the boundaries of what the human body could endure. Each case represented choices made by researchers who had prioritized scientific curiosity over human welfare. The work was emotionally demanding, but it provided meaning that her previous career had lacked. Instead of treating individual patients in isolation, she was now developing systems that would prevent similar atrocities from occurring in the future. Medical schools were incorporating ethics training based on the Morrison revelations, and international monitoring organizations had established new protocols for investigating suspected human experimentation. Rebecca's phone buzzed with a text message from a number she didn't recognize. The message contained only an address in Phoenix and a time, 3 p.m. today. She had learned to recognize communications from survivors of the research program, people who remained cautious about direct contact, but occasionally reached out when they needed help that couldn't be provided through official channels. 2 hours later, she sat in a coffee shop in downtown Phoenix across from a woman who appeared to be in her mid-30s but carried herself with the hypervigilance of someone who had survived significant trauma. The woman ordered coffee but didn't drink it, her hands remaining positioned where she could react quickly to any perceived threat. Dr. Martinez, my name is Jennifer Walsh. I was part of the program from 2018 to 2021, the facility in Colorado that officially never existed. Her voice was steady but quiet, suggesting years of practice at controlling emotional responses to memories that could trigger panic attacks or dissociative episodes. Rebecca listened as Jennifer described experiences that confirmed her suspicions about the program's scope and duration. Adults as well as children had been subjected to experimental treatments designed to enhance human performance, test resistance to biological agents, and explore the limits of psychological conditioning. The research had been conducted by people who viewed human subjects as expendable resources rather than individuals deserving of protection. There are others, Jennifer continued. People who were part of different experiments, different facilities. We've been finding each other through support networks, sharing information about what was done to us. Some of the research is still ongoing, just more carefully hidden. The revelation didn't surprise Rebecca, but it confirmed her belief that exposing one program had only scratched the surface of systematic human exploitation conducted under the protection of national security classifications. The individuals responsible for authorizing and conducting the research had faced minimal consequences, while their victims continued dealing with long-term effects of treatments that had never been intended to benefit their health. Jennifer handed Rebecca a flash drive containing documents that had been smuggled out of the Colorado facility before its official closure. Medical records, research protocols, personnel files. Everything needed to prove that the program was larger and more systematic than the congressional investigations revealed. Rebecca accepted the drive, knowing that using the information would require careful navigation of legal systems that remained reluctant to fully prosecute government-sponsored human experimentation. The political climate had shifted since her initial testimony, and there was pressure to move beyond the Morrison revelations rather than continuing investigations that implicated high-level officials. "What do you need from me?" Rebecca asked, though she already knew the answer. Jennifer and others like her needed someone with credibility and institutional access who would advocate for full accountability rather than allowing the program to be quietly forgotten. "Help us tell the complete story," Jennifer replied. "The children who died in those facilities deserve recognition. The survivors deserve justice. And the public deserves to know how their government treated human beings as laboratory animals." That evening, Rebecca stood on her apartment balcony overlooking Elliott Bay, processing the implications of what she had learned. The little girl she had carried out of that helicopter had been saved, but dozens of others had died in facilities where medical personnel had followed orders rather than medical ethics. The program had been exposed, but the institutional culture that enabled it remained largely intact. She thought about that night in the Nevada desert, sitting on a concrete curb outside an abandoned gas station, waiting for instructions that had led to the most important decision of her career: the choice to prioritize human dignity over institutional authority. Had cost her the career she had built, but it had given her a mission that provided meaning beyond anything she had previously experienced. Rebecca opened her laptop and began drafting an email to investigative journalists who had covered the Morrison revelations. Jennifer's documents would provide the foundation for exposing the full scope of classified human experimentation. Regardless of political pressure to let sleeping secrets remain buried, the real mission had been waiting for her in that parking lot after all. Not the classified operation described in encrypted orders, but the moral obligation to choose humanity over convenience when institutions demanded compliance with unconscionable acts. Every person who found the courage to refuse unethical orders, to prioritize human welfare over bureaucratic loyalty, was fighting the same battle she had engaged that night. Sometimes the most important helicopter that lands in your life carries not the mission you expected, but the moral test that defines who you choose to become when authority and conscience conflict. The courage to make that choice can save more than individual lives. It can preserve the humanity that institutions sometimes forget they're supposed to protect. The little girl was safe, the program was exposed, and the fight for accountability continued. That knowledge was enough to sustain Rebecca through whatever challenges awaited in a world where the powerful would always find new ways to exploit the vulnerable, and where ordinary people would always have the opportunity to choose courage over compliance. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.